The Middle Ages, or medieval period, falls between the time of the Roman Empire and the Renaissance. This between time is also commonly known as the Dark Ages. The period was marked by an intellectual withdrawal as people turned inward and focused on survival. Following the fall of Rome, monasteries became the bastion of cultural and intellectual life. Within the cloistered halls, the writings of times past were copied and maintained. These texts were frequently accompanied by illustration and decoration, and during the Middle Ages, the use of gold leaf in those decorations caused the manuscripts to come to life with light. As gold does not tarnish, the texts remain illuminated today and are objects of reverence and beauty, bringing light from a dark age. Life in the Middle Ages was brutally short, and by today's standards, miserable, even for the nobility. Over 90% of Europe's population lived as peasants and serfs, scratching a living from land they could not own and could not leave. The nobles in their castles may have had access to better clothing and food, but their keeps were drafty and smelly, and the food heavily spiced to hide the spoilage. Battle, famine, and plague were continual threats. The illuminated manuscripts of the time contrast sharply and remind us that the human spirit is indeed difficult to squelch. Reproduction of a text prior to the invention of the printing press was laborious, time-consuming, and expensive. Prior to the adoption of paper late in the 14th century, manuscripts in Europe were made of parchment. Parchment is made from animal skins, usually calfskin or sheepskin. Of necessity, parchment production is a long-term project, with the raising of the animals requiring the greatest investment of time. Although any animal skin could be used to produce parchment, usually calves and sheep were used as they provided meat, making parchment a fortunate byproduct. Once the skin was removed, it would be cleaned in fast-flowing water for a day or so. After cleaning, the skins would be packed in barrels of lime water to loosen the structure of the skins. Following a week-long soak, the hair could be sloughed off using a wooden paddle. The now hairless skins were next stretched on frames and left in the sun to dry. While on the stretching frame, the skin would be scraped to an even thinness on both sides. What began as a dirty, smelly, rough hide had been transformed to a smooth, flat surface ready to receive pigment. The new parchments would now be inspected for quality. Lower quality parchments that had perhaps not been carefully cleaned and scraped, or had imperfections due to scarring, would be used for utilitarian books such as medical texts or historical accounts. Only the high-quality parchments would be used in production of luxury illuminated manuscripts. In order to put the parchments in a book format, they would be folded and sewn. The number of folds depended upon the desired size of the finished product. Large books meant for ceremonial use might have parchments which were folded only once. Smaller books for personal use would contain parchments folded 2 or 3 times. A parchment, folded, sewn, and cut, would form a gathering or choir. Later, the choirs would be joined together and bound into a book, but the writing and illustration is easier accomplished on the flat surfaces of the choir. Before ink was applied to page, the text and illustrations would be carefully planned. In order to ensure even, straight lines of text throughout the manuscript, a grid would be placed on each page. The choirs would be stacked together and the edges pricked with a sharp instrument at regular intervals. Every page thus pricked would have matching marks which could be used to guide ruler and stylus to mark the grid. Early manuscripts were scored, making grooves which can only be seen by tilting the manuscript. Later manuscripts were gridded using either lead or pigment, which remained as part of the text. The scribe, armed with quill and knife, would now begin copying the text, leaving space for the planned decorative initials, borders, and illustrations. The ink used most often was made from gallnuts with the addition of iron filings. The addition of the iron filings caused the ink to be caustic, in essence, burning into the parchment. If a mistake were caught quickly, a knife could be used to scrape off the ink before it was permanently etched into the parchment. Scribes spent long hours laboriously copying texts. Those long hours did lead to mistakes, some of which incorporated into the text. Only 5% of the manuscripts produced during the Middle Ages were lavishly decorated. The majority of manuscripts were utilitarian in nature and were produced as efficiently as possible. No parchment would go to waste in such books. Margins were narrow, lines close together, and abbreviations common. In contrast, the illuminated manuscripts had wide margins, beautiful spacing, and fully formed words. The text and illustrations were both beautiful. The first step in illuminating a text was a tracing of the outline of the design, followed by the application of either gold leaf or powder. The application of gold required the use of gums or some other sort of gluey substance. Any pigment applied prior to the gold would be at risk of damage from the glues. In order to apply gold leaf, glue would be placed in the designated areas, and the gold leaf would then stick. At other times, the gold would be powdered and mixed with the glue in order to be painted on the surface. Once the gold had been applied, it was at last time for color. Pigments could be obtained from plants, such as indigo, minerals, such as lapis lazuli, or even insects, such as cochineal. A binding agent, such as egg white, was added to the pigment to help the pigment adhere to the parchment. A wash of middle tones would be applied first, followed by darker and lighter tones to create shading. While the themes of most illuminations were religious in nature, there was much opportunity for creative interpretation. This is especially evident in the more decorative aspects such as borders and carpet pages. These might contain fantastical animals, self-portraits, humorous images, and other evidences of artistic whimsy. The script and illumination complete, the manuscript is ready to be bound into a book. The pages of each quire may have been marked with a catchword or a number, enabling the quires to be assembled in order. Linen thread would be used to bind the quires together and attach leather thongs, which will be used to fasten the covers. Covers are made of wood, cut to the same size as the manuscript pages. Leather would be used to cover the boards of a utilitarian text. In contrast, a luxury text would be embellished with precious metals and jewels to indicate its status. During much of the Middle Ages, most manuscripts were produced in monasteries. The illumination of these texts intended to add to the glory of the sacred word. The gold and silver brought light to the word of God, inspiring awe. These illuminations, begun as an act of devotion, became status symbols for the rich and powerful, and demand for illuminated manuscripts grew over time. Eventually, demand for these status symbols outgrew the production capacity of the monasteries. Professional scribes and artisans began producing manuscripts in the urban centers of the medieval world. Today, we are fortunate to benefit from the beauty of these texts. Not only can we appreciate the beauty, but also the devotion represented by the hours of laborious, careful work inspire our admiration. The advent of the printing press signaled an end to the age of the illuminated manuscript, but the beginning of the age of literacy. Initially, books produced on printing presses were frequently illustrated by hand in order to compete with the quality of the illuminated manuscripts to which the customer was accustomed. Indeed, the illuminated manuscript remained a symbol of good taste, and printed books were scorned by some. Much as many readers of today scorn the advent of the digital age, so did many of the time scorn the printing press. We are fortunate that these beautiful items, although fragile in many ways, have endured for us to enjoy today.